Have you ever felt alone, carrying a burden that no one else seems to notice? That's exactly how the prophet Jeremiah felt, rejected, insecure, and surrounded by a chaos that seemed impossible to endure. But here's a truth few dare to say. God's calling is not always a well-lit road, and that's more common than you might think. Perhaps, as you get to know this man's story, you'll see your own reflection, your doubts, your tears, even your wavering faith. What many don't mention is that Jeremiah, despite all his anguish, received a powerful and transformative mission. And believe it or not, that mission could be yours too. Imagine discovering that your pain is not a sign of failure, but the beginning of something far greater. Get ready to understand how this prophet's biblical story challenges popular beliefs about success, fear, and faith. And of course, offers a hope no one is expecting to hear. This is not an invitation to run from pain or struggle. On the contrary, it's a call to face them head-on, with courage and understanding. If you're tired of easy answers and want something real, this content will show you that just like Jeremiah, you can transform your journey. And the best part, you'll understand that this difficult path carries a divine purpose few can perceive. Sometimes the voice of faith seems to whisper in the noise of the world, and it's precisely in that silence that Jeremiah's prophetic messages echo with power. This is not just a biblical story. It's an invitation to recognize the value of perseverance, of courage in the face of rejection, and of hope even when all seems lost. You'll see that Jeremiah was not just a man of tears and lament, but an example of living faith and concrete action. So if you've ever felt invisible, tired of fighting alone, or even afraid to follow a calling that seems impossible, this story is for you. Let's understand God's calling for Jeremiah together and discover how it resonates in your life today. Are you ready to look at pain with new eyes? To see a new covenant that goes beyond what human eyes can see? If so, this is the moment to dive into the story. Few people think about it, but God's calling rarely comes when we feel ready. The prophet Jeremiah was just an ordinary young man, with fears very similar to what any of us would have. Fear of not being enough, of not knowing what to say, of failing. And do you know what God said to him? Do not say, "I am only a child." In other words, when God calls, he has already considered your weakness. It's as if he's saying, "I know you can't do it, but I can do it through you." Imagine being summoned to a national mission, both spiritual and political, while you're still learning to deal with your own insecurities. That was exactly Jeremiah's reality. In a biblical narrative full of strong figures and supernatural experiences, Jeremiah emerges as someone real, human, vulnerable. That brings us closer. It makes us think, could it be that our insecurity is actually the perfect stage for God's glory? Most people think that to fulfill a calling, you need to be eloquent, confident, and preferably trained in public speaking. But the truth is, God loves to use the unlikely. Jeremiah's calling shows that obedience matters more than ability. If you feel God pulling you towards something, whether it's starting a ministry, reconciling with someone, or simply sharing your testimony, don't wait to feel ready. Respond with faith. Jeremiah's journey begins right there, in fear. But that fear was the raw material God used to build courage. That's why this biblical story isn't just about a prophet. It's about me, about you, about all of us who've heard that inner whisper saying, "Go, I am with you." And look, if you have that feeling that you don't fit the profile, maybe you're exactly who God wants to use. Because God's purpose doesn't depend on our resume, but on our surrender. What Jeremiah experienced was actually a divine push. God didn't just call him, he shaped him along the way. And here's a valuable lesson. God's calling never comes alone. It brings with it the equipping, the right words, and even the necessary tears. The secret isn't in being strong, but in being moldable. And that's something we can apply even in simple tasks. like accepting an invitation to lead a group or open the Bible with someone. If you look at your own life, you might realize you've already had similar experiences, opportunities that pushed you out of your comfort zone, hard conversations you had despite fear, invitations that seemed too big for your emotional structure. All of that is the ground of calling. The prophet Jeremiah teaches us that it's exactly in those moments when God shows up most clearly. Because when we see ourselves as small, He reveals Himself as great. Now imagine yourself insecure, trembling inside, being pushed by God to speak to kings, priests, and crowds. That's how Jeremiah's ministry began. And if that seems impossible, just wait to see what he faced next. A chaotic political landscape, a rebellious people, corrupt kings. And yet the same voice kept saying, "Speak, Jeremiah, I am sending you." The prophet Jeremiah lived during a turbulent time when the kingdom of Judah was on the brink of collapse. This chaotic political context was marked by corrupt kings, fragile alliances, and the looming threat of Babylon, a rising power that would soon dominate the region. For those who think prophecy is just something of the past, Jeremiah's biblical story shows that true faith stands precisely in the eye of the storm, where everything seems lost. Jeremiah held no political office nor popular influence. His strength came solely from God's calling. He denounced injustice and warned of destruction if the people did not repent. Imagine the challenge of confronting kings and rulers without fear, especially when those same leaders sought political stability at all costs, even if it meant ignoring the truth. This scenario teaches us a lot about maintaining faith in times of crisis. Think of situations in your daily life when everything seems to be falling apart, in your family, at work, or even inside your own mind. The prophet's courage inspires us to remain firm even when the news is bad, because true faith is not a comfortable refuge, but a firm foundation in the midst of chaos. Jeremiah's example also opens the door to understanding that faith is not blind. He knew Judah's political context was adverse, but he didn't use that as an excuse to remain silent. He spoke up, he rebuked, and most of all, he showed the urgency of a genuine return to God. Applying that today means acting with integrity even when it's easier to stay silent, and holding on to spiritual values in the face of worldly pressure. In practice, you might ask, how do I deal with the corrupt kingdoms around me? Toxic work environments, difficult relationships, or even news that shake our confidence? Jeremiah invites us to take a proactive stance, whether speaking the truth with respect, seeking justice, or simply holding on to a faith that withstands anything. Let's not forget that despite all the turmoil, Jeremiah held on to a firm hope. He believed in the greater purpose of God's calling, even when it placed him in direct conflict with the system. That hope fueled his prophetic messages and sustained him through the storm. And that is a timeless lesson. True faith does not deny suffering, but trusts in God's plan. As we reflect on this stage of the prophet Jeremiah's life, we begin to understand why the fight against idolatry and false religion was so decisive for his mission. This is where the spiritual battle truly unfolds, and we'll soon see how he faced not only human enemies, but also the invisible traps that lead people astray. Jeremiah faced a battle that went far beyond politics. It was a spiritual war against idolatry and religious hypocrisy corrupting Judah. It wasn't just about worshipping other gods, but the falsehood that permeated even the temples, with leaders using religion to deceive the people and maintain power. The biblical story reveals that this struggle is just as relevant today as it was in the prophet's time, because true faith demands authenticity, not just empty rituals. When Jeremiah denounced these false prophets, he wasn't doing it to be annoying. He wanted to wake the people up to a hard truth. When religion becomes a show, it loses its transformative power. That prophetic message challenges all of us to reflect on how we live out our spirituality. Is our faith just on autopilot or truly committed to God? A practical example today is evaluating where we place our trust. Jeremiah showed that idolatry can hide in many forms, an obsession with status, money, or even personal certainties that replace dependence on the divine. The fight against false religion, then, is an invitation to reassess our spiritual life, eliminate what is superficial, and renew our commitment to God with an open heart. Moreover, the prophet's courage in the face of religious leaders who conspired to silence him shows the importance of active faith. He didn't settle or accept spiritual mediocrity. For those who want to grow spiritually, this means stepping out of your comfort zone and confronting what is wrong, even if it brings discomfort or rejection. Jeremiah also teaches us that spiritual warfare is not only against external enemies, but against our own human tendencies that drift from the truth. That includes pride, fear, and resistance to change. A simple practice to help in this process is sincere prayer and regular self-examination, asking, "Where have I strayed?" and seeking strength to remain faithful. This battle against idolatry strengthens the prophet's calling and sets the stage for the personal conflicts he would face. Rejection and suffering came as inevitable consequences because faithfulness to God carries a price. And as we'll see, that pain reveals much about the character of someone called to serve in such a challenging mission. Now that we've grasped this deep spiritual struggle, we begin to enter the universe of Jeremiah's pain and rejection, a theme that will reveal the human side of courage and the strength needed to persist, despite it all. Jeremiah bore the weight of rejection like few others. Imagine being called to speak the truth, only to be met with closed doors, insults, and even violence. This was the harsh reality of the prophet Jeremiah, whose biblical story is marked by both physical and emotional suffering. He was imprisoned, assaulted, and discredited by those who were supposed to listen to his prophetic messages, an experience that resonates with all who face resistance for doing what is right. Being rejected by his own people was no easy burden, but Jeremiah teaches us a precious lesson. Faithfulness to one's calling sometimes requires enduring isolation. For those who feel misunderstood today for standing by their values or answering a divine call, the prophet's story is a source of inspiration to persevere. It's like that one friend who insists on doing what he believes is right, even when everyone else doubts him, because he knows he's headed in the right direction. Jeremiah's suffering also reveals a deeply human side that few recognize. In his prayers and laments, we see a man who feels pain, doubt, and even discouragement. He invites us to embrace that vulnerability, showing that strength is not the absence of emotion, but the will to keep going, even while feeling deeply. That's why it's worth investing in moments of personal and spiritual reflection to maintain faith in the face of adversity. Furthermore, the prophet's rejection reveals a natural resistance to confronting the truth. Many times, we prefer the comfort of lies or illusions over facing painful realities. Jeremiah breaks through this barrier by denouncing hypocrisy and injustice, even knowing he would be rejected. This is an invitation to look within and ask ourselves, when are we avoiding difficult truths in our own lives? It's remarkable how that rejection didn't silence Jeremiah. It strengthened his voice. He never lost focus on God's calling, even amid great suffering. Practically speaking, this teaches us the importance of a firm purpose to withstand the storms of life. If you feel you're going through a difficult season, remember, a clear sense of direction, like the one Jeremiah had, can be your greatest shield. By embracing this journey, Jeremiah becomes the embodiment of the true prophet, the one who speaks when no one wants to listen, yet refuses to give up. From this resistance, we begin to understand the solitude that comes with the courage of choosing truth over popularity. And that solitude prepares us for the lone voice of truth he would have to carry. Now, this solitary voice, one that echoes against the tide of public opinion, sets the stage for the next chapter. The courage to remain firm in times of spiritual silence, when few are willing to hear the prophetic messages that make them uncomfortable. Amid a crowd seeking easy comfort, the prophet Jeremiah stands out as a solitary voice. While many were proclaiming peace and stability, he issued harsh warnings about destruction and judgment. This contradiction was not born out of rebellion, but because God's calling required courage to speak the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. Have you ever kept quiet just to avoid going against the group? Jeremiah shows us that silence can come at a high cost. This kind of spiritual loneliness is a heavy burden, especially for those who genuinely care. Jeremiah faced the silence of the church and the people, who preferred comfortable silence over difficult truths. For anyone today who lives in environments where faith seems to be fading, the prophet's example is a call to keep the flame burning, even when the fire feels like it's dying out. It might seem like you're alone, but the truth has a strength that transcends generations. In his prophetic messages, Jeremiah remains firm because he understands that the truth sets us free, even when it hurts. This paradox is universal. Sometimes the words that bother us most are the ones we most need to hear. Like that honest friend who says what no one else has the courage to. And are you open to hearing these truths in your life? That openness is the first step toward mature faith. Jeremiah also reminds us of the importance of integrity, both in ministry and in life. There's no point in selling a message just to please everyone. When he speaks from the heart, even knowing it will cost him rejection. This is a reminder to be authentic in our convictions, whether in faith or in professional life. Authenticity builds trust, while falsehood only leads to exhaustion and damage. The prophet's courage in the face of silence and rejection is a living example for anyone who feels the weight of isolation for holding on to the truth. So how about creating a support circle with people who also value true faith? It could be a small group, a Bible study, or even an honest conversation with a friend. Sharing the burden makes the journey feel less lonely. It's interesting to note that this solitary voice didn't remain silent for long. Jeremiah used prophetic symbols and actions to make his message tangible and impactful. His creativity shows us that sometimes speaking the truth requires more than words. It requires action to touch another person's heart. And speaking of symbols, the next stage of this journey is understanding how Jeremiah gave shape to his message through objects and gestures that spoke louder than 1,000 words. Jeremiah did not limit himself to words. He made his message concrete through powerful symbols. Using objects and actions to convey spiritual truths was a brilliant strategy, especially because the Bible itself is full of such visual expressions. For example, the rotten belt or the broken pot he used spoke louder than any speech. Imagine if today, during a conversation, someone used a symbolic gesture to illustrate a complex issue. It would surely make it easier to understand, wouldn't it? These symbols weren't just meant to shock, but to make the people feel and reflect. They created an emotional impact that cold words rarely could. This is a valuable lesson for anyone who wants to communicate deep messages. You must engage both the heart and the mind. A good modern example would be using metaphors or analogies in a presentation to make the idea memorable. Another important point is that these symbols emphasize the urgency of his prophetic messages. When Jeremiah used a yoke to illustrate the weight of foreign domination, he wasn't just speaking, he was showing the harsh reality the people would face. It's an invitation for us to think about how we can use creative means to make our own messages more impactful, whether in a work meeting or a difficult conversation. Jeremiah's boldness in using these objects also reveals a very strategic form of communication. He knew that to break through the people's resistance, more than words were needed. A reaction had to be triggered. This teaches us the importance of adapting our message to the audience, considering context and emotion. A teacher, for instance, might use videos or dramatizations to better engage students. Moreover, these prophetic actions had a prophetic role. They symbolically announced the future. For example, the broken pot indicated the imminent destruction of Judah. This method can be seen as a preview of the new covenant, as it reveals that radical changes often come accompanied by signs and symbols. For us, this is a reminder to pay attention to the small things that point toward major transformations. Jeremiah shows us that to communicate something truly important, we sometimes need to step out of our comfort zone and innovate. Creativity in speaking truthfully, with humility and courage, can open doors even when resistance is strong. Think of new ways you can express your ideas today: a drawing, a story, a gesture. And so, with these striking symbols, Jeremiah announces the exile, but also prepares the ground for something greater, for the hope that will rise after the storm. The next stage of this prophetic journey leads us to reflect on exile and the promise of restoration that God offers to his people. Jeremiah lived through the painful moment of exile, when Judah was conquered and the people were taken far from their land. The biblical story shows us that, although it was a time of punishment, there was also a deep divine purpose, God's justice in action. It's hard to accept when life feels full of loss, but Jeremiah reminds us that even in the shadows, there is hope. Have you ever stopped to think that the hardest moments might be doors to a new beginning? Exile represents a painful separation, but Jeremiah also prophesied the people's return and the restoration God promised. This duality between judgment and hope is essential to understanding his prophetic messages. If you're facing a personal exile, a crisis at work or in a relationship, know that recovery is possible. Value the signs of hope that appear, no matter how small. One fascinating point is that God's justice is not vengeful, but corrective and transformative. Jeremiah makes it clear that punishment has a purpose: to cause the people to reflect and return to the right path. This can apply to our lives today. If something went wrong, instead of only complaining, it's time to look inward and search for what needs to change. How about doing an honest self-evaluation and identifying areas to grow? Moreover, Jeremiah announced a promise that went far beyond physical exile: the renewal of the covenant between God and his people. This promise lit a light at the end of the tunnel, showing that suffering is not the final chapter. Imagine that whenever you feel trapped, you could remember that a new covenant exists. A chance to start again, written on your heart, far greater than any setback. For those following the prophet Jeremiah's journey, this promise also points to the new covenant, which would forever change the relationship between God and humanity. This concept echoes powerfully in the gospel and stands as one of the most revolutionary messages in the biblical narrative. Embracing this hope can transform your perspective on both faith and life. In the midst of exile's pain, Jeremiah teaches us that justice and hope walk side by side, like two sides of the same coin. And in doing so, he prepares the people for a better future, a future only faith can reach. This is a practical lesson for today. Never underestimate the power of a new beginning, even when everything seems lost. And speaking of renewal, nothing is more powerful than the transformation of the heart, which leads us to the next step in the journey: the new covenant that changes everything. The new covenant that Jeremiah prophesied was a true revolution in how God would relate to his people. In the biblical story, this covenant would no longer be a set of external rules, but something internal, written directly on the hearts of people. Imagine transforming what was once rigid and unfeeling, like a heart of stone, into something alive, beating, and open. Doesn't that sound like an invitation to a profound change in how we live and love? This inner transformation is the core of Jeremiah's prophetic messages, showing that God desires more than outward obedience. He wants a genuine commitment that flows from within. If we think about it, many of today's problems stem from a lack of that true connection. So how can we practice this in our daily lives? Start with sincerity in your relationships, forgiveness, and a search for purpose beyond appearances. Jeremiah announces that in this new covenant, God's law would be written on the heart, naturally guiding actions and choices. Imagine a life where your values are so deeply rooted that they don't require constant reminders. They become part of who you are. For those seeking personal and spiritual growth, this is a powerful and liberating vision. It's not about fulfilling obligations, but about living a transformed reality. Another key point is that this new covenant represents hope and restoration after times of pain and exile. The prophet points to a future where the wounds of the past can be healed and the relationship with God and others restored. It's an invitation for each person to reflect on their own wounds and find practical ways to heal, through prayer, therapy, or reconciliation. This concept of inner change anticipated much of what would become the gospel, the good news that spread after Jeremiah's time. It's fascinating to see how his prophetic messages, though ancient, remain current and relevant. As you study this, it's worth reading passages in the New Testament to see how this covenant is fully realized in Jesus. Finally, understanding the new covenant helps us realize that faith is a dynamic journey, one of constant transformation. This is a reminder for those struggling to change. True transformation begins in the heart and is possible, even if it's slow. Small steps, daily acts of kindness, self-examination, and commitment can be the practical manifestation of that promise. So from hardened hearts to hearts of flesh, this covenant prepares us for a living and deep relationship with God. And it is through this movement that Jeremiah leads us to reflect on his own humanity, his laments, and his intimate dialogues with the Creator. Jeremiah is not just the firm and unshakable prophet many imagine. The biblical story reveals a deeply human man who expresses his pain, doubts, and even anger in sincere prayers to God. That vulnerability is what makes his prophetic messages so powerful, because he isn't just a mouthpiece, but someone who lives the reality of pain and uncertainty. Have you ever thought how freeing it is to pour out what you feel without fear of being judged? When we read Jeremiah's laments, we find a man who weeps for the destruction of his people, for the loneliness and rejection he suffers. That sincerity shows us that faith isn't the absence of emotion, but the courage to bring those emotions before God. If you're going through hard times, the advice here is, don't bottle everything up. Writing in a journal, talking to a trusted friend, or sincerely praying can be a first step to lighten the burden. More than just laments, Jeremiah's dialogues with God reveal an intimate relationship where he questions the reasons for suffering and seeks answers. This shows us that questioning God doesn't mean lack of faith, but a genuine search for understanding. Practically, this can be an invitation for anyone struggling with doubt. Don't pull away, but instead draw closer, seeking answers and strength. This humanity also brings an important lesson to those living their faith. We don't need to be perfect to serve God. Jeremiah was full of doubts, suffering, and fear, yet he fulfilled his calling. That's a comfort for anyone who feels insecure, as it reminds us that God chooses willing hearts, not flawless people. The prophet inspires us to be authentic in our spiritual journey, not to hide our weaknesses, but to seek, even in anguish, an open dialogue with God. That can transform the way we face our own challenges, turning pain into learning and hope. How about starting to practice that honesty today? Jeremiah's humanity also connects us with the emotional side of faith, showing that tears and sorrow are legitimate parts of the journey. This challenges us to care for our emotional and spiritual health, seeking support when needed. A practical tip is to set aside moments of silence and meditation to listen to your inner voice and God's. And of course, that painful intimacy with God sets the stage for the writing of the Book of Lamentations, where Jeremiah turns his grief into poetry, a deep transition you'll understand in the next topic. Texto Padrone, the Book of Lamentations, is one of the most poignant expressions in biblical history, where the prophet Jeremiah transforms his mourning into poetry. After the fall of Jerusalem, he doesn't hide his pain. He pours it into words that echo a deep cry for mercy. It's as if sadness became a bridge to hope, revealing that faith doesn't erase suffering. It crosses through it with courage. This poetic work is filled with strong and expressive images that help the reader enter the heart of collective suffering. Jerusalem is described as a lonely widow, a mother who has lost her children, metaphors that still move us today and help us grasp the gravity of the situation. In our daily lives, we can relate these to moments of loss and pain, which, though personal, connect us to the universal human experience of grief. Interestingly, even in the midst of such sorrow, the book still affirms that the Lord's mercies never end. That phrase is an invitation to keep hope and trust in God alive, even when everything seems lost. For those facing challenges, this message can be a balm, reminding us that the end of a story is not always the end of the journey. Moreover, the book teaches us the importance of expressing our emotions, something often overlooked. Jeremiah shows us there's no shame in feeling sadness, anger, or despair, as long as we don't drown in those emotions. Practicing this expression can be as simple as writing about how we feel, talking to friends, or seeking professional help. Texto Padrone. The artistic nature of Lamentations also deserves attention. By using poetry to deal with such heavy themes, Jeremiah invites us to reflect on the beauty that can emerge from suffering when it's transformed into art and expression. That can inspire us to create, whether through writing, drawing, or even sharing our experiences, giving meaning to them. This connection between suffering, art, and faith opens a path for us to better understand the prophetic messages of Jeremiah. Messages that speak not only of judgment, but of restoration and God's enduring love. And this perspective sheds light on the next reflection, the legacy this prophet left behind. Finally, the Book of Lamentations is a powerful reminder that in both biblical history and life, pain is not the final chapter. It's a passage, a preparation for the hope that comes next, which we'll uncover as we explore Jeremiah's legacy. The legacy of the prophet Jeremiah is a lesson in how true success often escapes the human eye. During his lifetime, he was ignored, rejected, and even considered a failure. But his faithfulness and courage in the face of adversity made him a pivotal figure in biblical history. This reminds us that what seems like failure may actually be the seed of something greater. Jeremiah showed that fulfilling God's calling can be lonely and painful, especially when the message goes against what most people want to hear. He was an example of resilience, standing firm even when no one supported him. Anyone today who faces resistance in their own projects can be inspired by his perseverance. It may be the key to turning obstacles into opportunities. Moreover, Jeremiah's legacy teaches that faithfulness is not measured by external recognition, but by the integrity of the heart. He reminds us that true victory lies in obeying God's voice, even when it requires personal sacrifice. In practice, this means living a life aligned with your values without being shaken by criticism or rejection. His life is also an invitation to consider the long-term impact of our actions. Often, what we do now isn't recognized immediately, but may bear fruit that will only be seen in the future. That's why it's essential to invest in meaningful causes, even if the results aren't immediate, whether in relationships, work, or faith. Interestingly, despite all his hardships, Jeremiah left behind a legacy of hope and restoration that spanned generations. This prompts us to reflect on how our personal stories can contribute to something greater, even when they seem small or insignificant in the moment. What legacy do you want to leave? This understanding broadens our vision of the role of prophetic messages. They're not confined to Jeremiah's time, but continue speaking to hearts seeking meaning and direction. And this reflection prepares us to revisit the prophet's initial calling, completing the full cycle of his journey. Now that you've immersed yourself in the life of the prophet Jeremiah, you can clearly see how his calling, his struggles, and his prophetic messages have so much to teach us, especially in times of personal and collective crisis. The question is, how can you apply Jeremiah's courage and faith in your own life? What voices have you been ignoring or avoiding out of fear or insecurity? Could it be time to listen to God's call to act with more authenticity and hope? I challenge you to reflect on that and not let silence or rejection prevent your growth. If Jeremiah, even while misunderstood and suffering, remained steadfast, why can't you do the same? Take this knowledge and transform your life. Start now by writing your own laments and, more importantly, your own promises of renewal. Did you enjoy this content? Then subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me on this journey of discovery and faith. The next video will dive even deeper into the prophetic messages that transform lives and the world around us. Don't miss it.